Thank you to the committee. I will just note that I do have some further information that I'd be happy to table afterwards to make sure that I can keep it under 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, everybody who's attended, and I'd like to thank the committee specifically for making the time to come to beautiful Hanna and ensure that consultations include rural Alberta, and as well thank the committee, the 30th Alberta Legislature, and the UCP, including the Premier, for their work on this important issue. First, let me note that I share today, as was said, both as an Albertan who cares about the issue of rural property rights, but also as a rural member of Parliament who has heard from many constituents about how the conversation around property rights is important. I would also note that my comments are founded on the belief that federalism works when different levels of government respect each other and their responsibilities, along with the decisions they make. So in no way take my comments today as being prescriptive to your work, but rather hopefully complementary. Let me emphasize, property rights are foundational to a free and democratic society. They ensure that citizens can enjoy the fruits of their labor and can sleep soundly knowing that no entity, whether it be private or public, can encroach on the property that they have rightfully and fairly attained. This is a fundamental Western and liberal, small L liberal, democratic value, and provides much of the basis for how the free market economy has been able to create an unprecedented standard of living in the history of the world. We see around how without safeguards, these rights can be lost. However, this is an issue in Canada as well, and I would point to the irresponsible actions by the current Liberal government that have shaken the various aspects of the security that citizens and the confidence that economic players like businesses or other governments who would like to do business or trade with Canada need to have in our nation. Although not limited to this, I speak specifically and would like to reference the recent invocation of the Emergencies Act by Prime Minister Trudeau and his government. This decision impacted property rights, freedom of assembly and expression, and the confidence needed in our national financial system. Let me emphasize that the irresponsible actions of our current Prime Minister in this matter have left many others, and many others have shaken our nation, and the implications will be felt for years. There's a lot to do, and today I would like to propose the following recommendations for your committee to consider. Number one, that the 30th Legislature of the province of Alberta use all the tools it has available to protect property rights in the province of Alberta. Two, that the government of Alberta apply pressure to other provinces, territories, and the federal government to address this important issue. And three, that the legislature, the government, and all stakeholders work to bring awareness to our shared constituents, our province, and our nation on this issue. For the record, and being part of your committee's mandate, if I would have been given the opportunity, I would have voted in favor of Bill 206. The belief that I have in the need for property rights is one that I share with my Conservative colleagues in Ottawa. The Conservative Party of Canada's policy declaration makes this clear, including the need for constitutional reform to include property rights. Alberta can set the precedent to ensure that property rights are respected through legislative means and forward the national conversation around needed constitutional reform. And I would note that that's not only pertaining to property rights, but other areas as well. As a member of Canada's Parliament in Her Majesty's loyal opposition, I would lend support to that concept to the committee here today. Therefore, I would also make the following recommendation for the committee to consider. That 4, the entrenchment of property rights in the Constitution of Canada is not only necessary, but imperative to a well-functioning parliamentary democracy. The above cannot be understated and is consistent with past legislative direction in Canada. Famously, in 1960, John Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservative government saw the Canadian Bill of Rights receive royal assent. Section 1A proclaims the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. Although not enshrined within Canada's constitutional framework, I would note that the Supreme Court does reference the Bill of Rights as being what is considered quasi-constitutional. However, without clear constitutional direction, it falls largely upon provinces to legislate this, with some exceptions, something I'd be happy to highlight in questions after. Common law Precedent, legislative protections, and stable governance have helped provide the certainty related to freedom and economic prosperity that we have here in Canada. This, as I've noted, however, cannot be taken for granted. I hear about this from constituents often, and I would like to take a moment to briefly share a few examples, and again, I'd be happy to expand on these after in the Q&As. The statements and issues that I hear about include combating crime and the protection of victims, rural issues and the need for entrenched rights that respect rural Canadians, the protection of lawfully owned property like firearms from unfair government seizure, and for recognizing that Indigenous peoples can be empowered by having property rights on reserve, something that is consistent with efforts for reconciliation and the TRC calls to justice. Other democratic nations have enshrined these rights in their laws, constitutions, charters, and other central governing documents. For example, many European nations have enacted stringent regulations on the impediments that can be placed on an individual's private property. Countries such as Finland, Sweden, Holland, and Germany have measures in place to ensure that private property owners are treated fairly and justly and that their rights are protected. For the sake of time, I won't get into the many examples that exist, but a recent example that I believe would be valuable for the committee to look at includes the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. I'd be happy to table some of the wording of that charter into the record. I would also reference the United States. The U.S. arguably was founded on the idea of property rights, and the U.S. Constitution directly references property rights in a number of places, notably in the Fifth Amendment's taking clause and the 14th Amendment that was passed after the Civil War regarding citizenship and equal protection under the law. There is much more to hear on this. However, I would encourage the committee to hear from the many experts on U.S. constitutional law that I have no doubt would be happy to share their findings with you. As you can see, Canada's acknowledgement of property rights falls behind its peers in the democratic world. But Chair, if you would allow me, I would like to note and make a recommendation as well for the committee to consider. It's not directly related to your mandate, however, an important periphery discussion, and this is around intellectual property rights, digital privacy rights, and blockchain's use, including things like cryptocurrency. I would suggest, therefore, that this committee recommend that those be studied more in depth and be given careful consideration about their impact and implications. Property rights are needed to protect citizens, provide a stable and predictable environment to invest in, and rightly limit government overreach. One has to acknowledge, however, that it is important to find the right balance. This committee is tasked with reviewing several acts where the government would be able to lawfully acquire property through often quasi-judicial processes. To not endeavor to find the right balance could lead to a scenario where essential infrastructure can never be built, whereas not having adequate rights allows for citizens to be abused by government or the well-connected. Therefore, the final recommendation that I would urge the committee to consider is this. When determining legislation, making recommendations, and proposing constitutional change for real property rights, that the rights of citizens need to be prioritized, but that a respectful balance is found in relation to the competing interests that exist. In closing, Chair, and to members of the committee and all of those who have come out today, I believe it is well-founded that everyone has the right to life, liberty, security of the person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. You all are tasked and have the opportunity to make change in that regard here in the province of Alberta, and I hope that can be a conversation that can be continued across our country and lead the way to ensuring that property rights are respected in our nation. Thank you to the committee